In Amorphium Pro, you have windows like this one that you use to see your 3D environment and be able to work with your objects and within your scene. Now, you'll notice that this window here, which is my camera view in Composer, is going to have slightly different menus here at the top than say in the tools or the object modification sections. You'll notice that they're slightly different. And the reason it is because in tools and effects and height shop and these other object modification sections of Amorphium, you're dealing with individual objects, one object at a time. So these are pertaining to that particular view and one object that you're working with. Whereas Composer, you're dealing with the complete scene with lights, cameras, multiple objects, and animations, and so there are, of course, going to be different types of options you can have. Now, first talking about the way the window works within Composer, right now we're looking at a camera view. Well, you have multiple views that you can use, and under the camera pop-down menu you can go from a front, right, top, isometric, or camera view. And you can even create new cameras. But just to show you what those look like, you have front and right views, where it's looking at your scene from different angles, top view. And of course the camera view. And you'll notice the difference between a camera view and an isometric view. Now you notice how in the isometric view you've got perfectly parallel lines in your grid, which basically would be like a blueprint. If you're looking at kind of a three-dimensional blueprint, you don't want the lines to be perspective and be off parallel, so you can actually see whether your walls are lining up or whatever. An isometric view allows you to be able to see if things are actually parallel and whatnot, and it doesn't have the camera distortion or the lens distortion that you see through a camera lens. Whereas your camera perspective, you'll notice you're seeing a distortion, which is more realistic to what our eyes see because of the distortion of a lens. So you're seeing a vanishing point where these lines are not perfectly parallel. They are actually vanishing off to a point off in distance out here somewhere. So you actually end up having a horizon line. And so that's the difference between a camera and isometric view. So within Composer, you do have those choices. Now, there's also a display mode where in Composer you may want to see the wireframe because you're dealing with optimizing your objects, or manipulating large objects or many objects, and you want to be able to see how dense your objects are. And so you can see that with wireframe it'll let you see visually how dense your objects are. And you can see this is a pretty dense mesh. And the reason for having that display within Composer here is because you also have these mesh optimization tools for things like making your mesh less dense, and it allows you to visually see that. That's the reason for having a wireframe view. Point cloud will let you see the actual physical points, the actual vertices, so this can really speed up the refresh of your display if you're just viewing the points, and it'll give you like a visual representation of how the shape of your object through the points, but not have the density of the mesh so you can actually see through it. Paint, the difference between paint and shaded is that paint just shows you the color that has been painted on the surface, which of course we will cover in the paint section of the paint and surfacing section of the CD. But it shows you the paint on the surface of an object and the color of the object. Whereas if I go to shaded, the best way to show this is I'll just put a quick little cloud texture here. So you can see that in shaded mode it'll actually show the texture that's been placed on your object in real time, and paint will just show you the underlying color that's underneath any surface texture. So, which also speeds it up because it doesn't show the real-time texturing. It doesn't have to actually texture wrap onto the surface. So if you just want to see a paint shaded view, you can do that as well. Since you're working with multiple objects, cameras, and lighting, you have this nice little select menu, which will let you select everything in your scene, or you can deselect everything. Select only the mesh objects, or your biospheres and wax objects, which I'll cover later. And then you can select just your lights. You can duplicate the selected items, so if you wanted to select all, and let me go ahead and zoom out a little bit here. So you can see that my light is also selected with the object. And you'll notice that with select all, that it's selecting everything except for the camera. And the reason that is that normally when you're selecting everything, you're going to want to select everything so you can move everything, so like you can move all your stuff around. Now if I did a select all and it selected the camera as well, then if I moved, the camera is going to be locked to those objects because they're all selected together. And so the only thing that's going to appear to move is the background, because the camera is actually moving with all the objects. So that's the reason for when you do a select all, it does not select the camera, because that is generally not the desired result. If it is, you can do a select all, then just select the camera by clicking on it down here. So also, if I were to select all actually here like this, and I do a duplicate selected, this will duplicate both the light and the object. So you can see now I have an actual copy of those two. And so now if I move them, you can see that they're there. And of course I can delete the selected as well. So it deletes whatever was selected. And lastly, in the window here in Composer, you have this fit. And the reason why that's in here and not in the Tools section is because you're dealing again with lights, cameras, and multiple objects as opposed to one object at a time. If you were to get, say, select an object and you say, oh, I just want to work on that object right now in Composer, or I want to find that object because it got zoomed off, you can actually select the object, then say fit to selection, and it will fit that particular object in your view. It'll fit whatever you have selected. So if I select all and say fit selection, it fits the light and the object, which I could have done also with fit scene, which just fits everything in your scene into view. So that's basically working with a window inside Composer. Now if I go to any of these other sections, you'll see that there are 4 different pop-up menus, and basically that's for working with inside this view, since it is a slightly different type of view, which you'll notice the object's kind of suspended in space, and I can rotate it right here in space. And it's a different type of view than Composer because it's kind of centering around this object. You're just working with one object at a time, so it kind of floats that object in the middle of your view. So unless of course I move it over. So what zoom allows me to do is to be able to, like if I have an object, if I'm working with a small object, and then I, like for example, let me just go ahead and I will make another sphere, but make a really big one. And then if I go into Tools and I switch between objects, you'll notice that this is really big. It's, you know, based on one scale type. So if I'm working with a small object, then all of a sudden I move to a big object, it's like, whoa, it's like this really big thing and you can't really see it. Well, zoom allows you to be able to say, okay, zoom out or zoom in to the object, and be able to, or I can just say fit and it will fit it to the extent, which is kind of a nice little feature. So then if I come back to this one, he's of course smaller. Now the view section here is very similar to the camera menu, choosing your view, but the difference being that since this is just kind of a floating view, it's just going to kind of move to a top and back, which is kind of hard to tell with this object, but basically it allows you to snap to a different view of your object. ISO is whatever rotated position. If you rotated your object to a custom position, that's considered an ISO view. So then you have where your positioning of your light is. You can grab your light and move it around, but you can also just say I want to default front straight on, or I want to come straight from the top and look at your light from different angles. ISO is kind of up in the corner. And so now the last thing in here is something for modeling, which actually will work better. We're using this object here. It's called the potter's wheel. Now there's a few things you can do with the potter's wheel. The potter's wheel allows you to do, well, basically like a potter wheel. It spins the object. Now since this is a sphere, you can't really tell that it's spinning, but it is spinning. So if I were to use a tool here, and actually let me just go ahead and use my brush, Now you'll notice that it is spinning, so this allows me to work on an object as if it's like on a potter's wheel, and be able to have it spinning and do this type of effect. And now you can adjust those settings by coming into vertical options and adjust the speed. So if I want to go faster, you can see it spinning faster now. I can have it spin the other direction and really slow it down if I want. And then there's this all-axis potter's wheel, which kind of spins the object on all axes. So if you want to do some really bizarre type of shapes, you can spin it that way and use your tools on it. The all-axis options gives you the speed for the various axes. So if I want it to really spin on two of the axes and then it's really slow on another, you can do that and get some really bizarre effects with. So if I sit here and start pushing, will actually give me more pressure here. Start pushing on the surface, you can see I can get some really bizarre effects. Now, what manual does is it rotates the object as you move your brush. So for example, as I start to move my brush one way, it rotates the object the other way. So if I wanted, you'll notice that I can move my brush back and forth, and then it's rotating the object, which can kind of be neat for certain stylized effects that you want to do, create different surface shapes on your object. So that's what the manual potter's wheel does. And you just turn it off if you want to just work on it like a normal object. Now the last thing about windows I'd like to cover is the fact that you can have multiple windows. And it works both in Composer and in your other modeling options here. So now if I go into Windows down here at the little pop-up at the bottom, I can close all my windows, get rid of them all. I can just create a new window anytime I want and say, oh, let's fit that. And then create another new one. And basically create different views. Create my own little interface per se. Say make this a left view. You know, basically create my own windows and place them however I want. You also have the option to say I'd like to just go back to a single view, and it'll bring the single window up. I can say dual view, it'll bring up two windows, or I've got a small window and a larger window. I can also go to a quad view, which gives me the kind of quad view of my objects, looking at all different angles. So I have an ISO view, which is kind of a rotated view, and then my top, front, and right, which is kind of hard to see from this because it's a sphere. Let me go ahead and actually create a go ahead and get rid of this large one here, and I'll get rid of this guy too, and I'll just create a cone, a little easier to see with a cone. So if I come back in here, you can see my different views. Now, the interesting thing too is that I have quad view here, but when I came to Composer, I only have one view. That's because you have separate options for both view types. So if I'm working in my modeling sections, I set up different windows than in the Composer. And of course, you have still all those options for Composer as well if you want to work in that sort of style. So that's pretty much how working with windows, you can modify them however you like. When you save the project, it remembers where the windows are placed, and you have pretty much full control over the positioning and types of views of your windows. And if you just click in this little corner down here, you can drag. As soon as you see the icon change, you're able to drag and shape it the way you want. So that's basically how windows work inside Amorphium.